Hi, Tyler.
Hey, Bob.
How you
Hey,
doing?
pretty good.
Good. Let me
All
introduce
right.
us. I'm Robert Wright of the Wright Show. You are Tyler Volk, professor of biology and environmental studies at New York University, among other things, the author of a number of books, one of which we're going to talk about. It's called Quarks to, well, you know what? Strictly speaking, it would be hard to tell from looking at the jacket what it's called because you could read it one of two ways, right? I mean, now
Yeah.
I've got the Kindle version, so this may not show up very well, but the it's like, is it this or is it this? You
It's
turn it.
actually 90 Yeah, that's it right there.
Whoops,
Yeah,
yeah, my,
that's the
my
cover.
phone's acting up. But anyway, I think the answer is quarks to culture,
Quarks
how,
to culture, that's the direction it goes.
not
Yeah.
culture to quarks, and the subtitle is how we came to be. Is it safe to call this book ambitious?
Okay.
Would you
I,
call it that?
yeah, you're not the first.
Uh-huh. Is that a problem?
No.
It's not. You know that.
I worked on it for a while, so I guess I put some time into it, so I guess there was something ambitious. Although it began kind of with a simple idea. I mean, I wanted to see if I could uh, distinguish fundamental levels of buildup in the saga, the pathway that went from quarks at the beginning of the universe to culture, billions
Right.
of years later.
Right. So saga is a good word because it is, you identify it from the beginning as a story, a narrative, a
Yeah,
science-based story. I guess you could call it the story, I don't know, the history of matter with special, since the Big Bang, with special emphasis on a particular planet in which matter eventually assumed the form of life and evolved.
yeah,
But it's all the way from subatomic particles to the world we live in today,
right,
which is
right.
pretty ambitious. Now, why did you want to tell this story as a story?
I actually, so even though I use the word saga or then you use the word story, and I'm good with that myself, narrative. I think there's a science here as well as a story because the way I frame it in my mind is that depending on what discipline a person may be in, they might tell this how this pathway happened differently. So a paleontologist is going to emphasize the extinction of the dinosaurs as one of the events, and I wanted to have a certain kind of logic to try to take myself out uh, of too much subjectivity in this, although the subjectivity is important because we are subjective human beings. But the way I did that is by saying that I wanted to limit the events to when combinations of prior existing things merge to form a new kind of thing. And I wanted to do that consistently so that it's in a way a repeating pattern,
Right.
which could even be an ontological, science
So,
or
like when
pattern.
cells come together to form multicelled organisms, for example, that's one of the kinds of thresholds that you want to focus on.
Correct.
But
Correct.
it starts much earlier than that, and it ends much later than that. What is there a But when I ask about the idea of telling a story, it is a science-based story, but it's still
Right.
kind of told as a story. Um, is there a particular kind of effect you wanted to have on the reader's mind? Is there something you wanted to get them to focus on about the world or about reality or
Yeah. I wanted people to say when if they read this deeply enough to get it, to say, wow, this is really extraordinary that there was a repeating pattern that went from physics and chemistry into biology and continued in culture, so that there's in a sense, a phenomenon that is an abstract phenomenon in that it gets repeated in different instantiations
Mhm.
as the cutting edge or the avant-garde things of the universe changed from being physical entities to biological entities to cultural entities.
So avant-garde, it's usually used in the arts, but it literally means advanced guard, I guess, right? So you're
kind of advanced guard, yeah. So at one point, the molecule was the most sophisticated thing in creation in terms of the nestedness of buildup, and then the prokaryotic cell, in a way, superseded that, made of molecules, and the eukaryotic cell, made of prokaryotic cells, superseded that. I mean, it doesn't mean everything in the universe became parts of these mergers, but some particular lineages did. So I don't want to. I'm not the story. The story is not to how quarks went to clouds, although that was, that's its own kind of pathway, but how quarks went to people, because we're particularly interested in ourselves.
We write the books. We can decide what it is.
We can decide. Yeah, the clouds can write their own books.
If the clouds are so smart, why aren't they writing their own books?
That's right.
Okay, so let's we'll get back to any takeaway lessons you may hope to impart to the reader. But let's start at the beginning with these, like, with the smallest things. I mean, again, the repeating thing is small things get integrated into larger units. That just keeps happening, and it happens in so-called prebiotic world, before life. Yeah. And then it happens in life. And one interesting thing about the book, I should say, is these two systems are often thought of as being very, very different. I mean, there's a set of analytical tools we use to describe the evolution of life.
Right.
And then there's physics, which describes non-life, and right. But you're telling it as a unified kind of ascent, in a certain sense.
Right, in a certain sense. And now new dynamics, what I like to call dynamics, do come in with biology, and we can get into that, because now you have the dynamics of biological evolution that are producing and have to be part of the explanation for these mergers, which I call these events of combogenesis, because I didn't really have a word that was already existing that could take these concepts from physics into biology and into culture. This idea of merging. So combogenesis is the genesis by combination.
Birth through combination.
Yeah. Yes.
So what's the first case in the whole history of the universe of small things getting integrated into larger things?
Well, if we begin with the entities of the standard model of particle physics as the ground level, and now I'm not saying there's not something deeper, but it's not yet known. Physicists are actively debating this, as you know. With preons or superstrings or things within it. But if we take the entities of the standard model of particle physics, which include electrons, they include the quarks, they include the gluons, the photons, they include a number of things which are in kind of a grid. Actually, I'll just show you that, so people can look up the standard model of particle physics. If we take that as the base, then the first level of combining are the quarks and the gluons to make protons and neutrons. So the protons and neutrons inside the nuclei of atoms would be, in a sense, the first established systems, and that would be the first event of combogenesis. Okay.
And they unite. So first, quarks and things unite to form themselves subatomic particles, right? They unite to form a kind of subatomic particle. So subatomic particles unite to form subatomic particles.
Right.
And then subatomic particles unite to form atoms.
Right.
Now,
well, no. Then you get nuclei.
Right. Okay.
Then protons and neutrons for nuclei, and those nuclei, which are formed. Some are formed really early in the universe, but most of the ones in our body and the complex atoms are formed in stars, in the nuclear reactions in stars. And then as those are exiting stars, they pick up electrons that are in the stars, and so you get atoms. So atoms are actually level 4 by just trying to stay with the logic, not with the way I would want it to be, or to sort of jump quickly, but to try to strictly stay with the logic. And there's one more important point that can come into our conversation. I'll show you another diagram here.
Sure. Now, we do have some audio podcast listeners, but we can try to summarize anything critically important. This is labeled things and relations.
Yes.
And what are you showing us with that?
On the left. So there's the things and relations on your left at the prior level, and they combine to form a larger thing on the right-hand side with what's combogenesis is the generic term, and you get a larger thing made of the what had been the most advanced stuff on the left, and are now components of this larger thing at a new fundamental level. And one thing I want to point out, on the left there's sort of dashed lines from these smaller spheres, and on the right they're drawn as a wavy line. That's to represent that there are new relations born with this combogenesis. You not only get a larger new thing, but that new thing has new kinds of properties that allows it to relate to the universe in new ways, and what the key is, it can relate to entities at its own level through those new kinds of relationships.
Okay.
And so you get a recursiveness, and then the one on your right goes back and becomes, in a sense, ones on the left, and they cycle around and around.
Right. So little things that are of comparable, the same kind of size and properties, relate to one another in a way that leads them to become a bigger thing, and then the bigger thing has the same dynamic recur with its fellow slightly bigger things.
Right, through these new relations.
Through the new relations of the things to the things. Now, yes, I want to talk about the relations. Go ahead, say what else you were going to say.
Because one more important point is that it therefore cannot jump, that there were things in level 6, there were relations that the things in level 6 had to get to, that were necessary conditions, not necessarily sufficient conditions, but necessary conditions to get to level 7 that could not have happened from level 5 directly.
Right.
So that there is a kind of necessity, at least on our world here, you and me talking as part of part of culture, possibly level 13 if we're going global at this point, but definitely level 11 of the geopolitical state, level 12 of the geopolitical state. But they were necessary. Each one was a necessary precursor. We cannot say it was determined. Not say it had to be in any universe.
So as you've just suggested, as we get to higher and higher levels of organization, we will get to political entities such as nation states, but we're not there yet. So on the relations among the entities, let's take subatomic particles. I noticed that in your book you talk about use the word cooperation. So like protons cooperating with something else to form
neutrons.
Neutrons to form a larger structure. Now, have you gotten into trouble at all for using the word cooperate, to kind of anthropomorphizing them, or?
No, not yet. I mean, I try to.
Would you like to?
I try to cover my bases in that. You're pushing me a little bit on the cooperation, but the protons and neutrons, just as one example, what I mean by cooperation and protons and neutrons in the atomic nuclei, they don't just glue. Well, they do in a sense glue together to form the atomic nuclei, but protons. The number of protons are important for the atomic properties of the atom when electrons come around the balls of protons, but protons by themselves could not have formed composites because the repulsive forces among the protons are larger than the gluing forces, the attractive forces of the weakened gluon properties that come out of the proton. But with the neutron there as a neutral object, you get some more attractive atomic force without more repulsive force. So that the neutrons are important for forming the nuclei. And then the neutron, which I didn't know before actually investigating this, even though it was a known fact of particle physics, the neutrons by themselves disintegrate or decay, as the physicists like to say, in about 15 minutes of time. So the neutron cannot even live by itself.
That's interesting.
Unless it's with
so
the
it has to form a larger structure to survive.
Correct.
Okay, the reason that's very interesting, because here's the reason I asked the cooperation question. So I wrote a book called Nonzero, in which I looked at both the evolution of human culture, starting with the very beginning of human technology, but also the biological evolution. And I argued that you could look at both, analyze both in game theoretical terms of zero-sum and non-zero-sum games. And as you know, cooperation is typically a product of a non-zero-sum game. When it's humans cooperating, there's often a conscious recognition that they're getting something out of it, and maybe even that the other person is getting something out of it. In other words, that it is a non-zero-sum game, a potentially win-win game. Now, there's not always that conscious recognition, because we have emotions that just kind of draw us into affiliative relationships that may have these benefits. But in any event, the reason, the question arises, like, why would I have felt justified talking about like the components of a eukaryotic cell having a non-zero-sum relationship to one another, or the genes on a genome having a non-zero-sum, cooperating in a sense, given that they can't think about it at all. Right. And the answer I came up with is, well, okay, but they would not be here if they weren't cooperative. In other words, natural selection, they would have fallen by the wayside. Yes. And not be around. You don't find like little genes just floating off in space. I mean, as natural selection allowed them to keep surviving. In other words, the genes on the genome would not exist if they were not cooperating with one another. And after writing the book, I came in contact with some of Stuart Kauffman's hypothesizing about the origin of life, and I thought, the way he's describing the prebiotic world, which is well after the part of your book that you've talked about so far, but the immediately right before the origin of life, I thought, well, the way he's describing it, you could kind of describe these things as having non-zero-sum relationships, because if they didn't come into relationship with one another, they would fall by the wayside and not survive. And you're saying that dynamic goes all the way back to the Big Bang, right? These subatomic particles would disappear if they didn't find larger relationships to be part of.
Well, at that particular level with the proton and neutron, which is particularly clean because it's a binary system. It's the protons and neutrons, and you can define what they do. But when you get to the atom with electrons now around these nuclei, electrons would not be in families. Could not be in these sort of orbital, complexly shaped orbital families without the nucleus already being stable to hold those electrons in, and that allows the electrons to obey different kinds of laws. Right. I mean, it's also kind of the nucleus and the electron are kind of a binary system too, because now you get the cooperation of the attractive force of the positive and negative charges. But just to kind of make it faster, to get us into biology and culture eventually, but the electrons would not. So now you get these orbitals, and because the electrons are obeying certain mathematical rules of being in these families of orbitals with certain preferred numbers and non-preferred numbers, they can then cooperate to form molecules. Now you can get atomic bonding to form molecules, and at the molecule, and what I find fascinating is that at the atom level, you now have so many types of atoms, and they can combine in so many ways that at the molecule way, you basically have an explosion of possibility into near infinite complexity, which you did not have before. So that was that, and that allowed the origin of life. So at the molecule level, because there's so many trillions of possible molecules, the molecules then combining in very complicated chemical reactions could lead to a prokaryotic cell in our current understanding.
Okay, but before that happens, you have to come up with the patterns of information have to start replicating themselves. So now that's not happening in the prebiotic, the pre-living world, right? So like these neutrons and protons, we can say that in a certain sense they are selected the ones that get into stable relationships survive. There is that analogy with natural selection. On the other hand, they're not replicating themselves, right?
They're not replicating themselves. So that's so even though new relations come in at each level that allow the next level to come into existence, or at least sort of set the stage for its possibility to come into existence, up until the molecule, these are sort of independent creation events. So every atom kind of gets independently created. We can look at Mars and analyze the minerals there.
And so is the reason that there are so many atoms just because the universe, just by virtue of its physics, just generates a ton of subatomic particles? At the very beginning, it basically, inherent in the universe at the very beginning, was just a ton of ton, to put it mildly, of subatomic particles. And then there's just so many of them that if a fair number of do manage to get into these stable relationships, you're going to have a whole lot of atoms.
Right, and that happens many, many times. So in the physical chemical realm, what I like to call now the dynamical realm of physical laws, these are independent events happening. Once you get life, it looks like all of life on Earth came from kind of a single origin. We don't know exactly what that was, so the new dynamics with the origin of the prokaryotic cell, as you've been talking about, are biological evolution. Now, the way I like to frame the coming into existence of biological evolution is what are the characteristics of these cells. One thing is that they need imports. They have to import matter and energy into them to exist, because their molecules are so complicated inside these bodies that they're breaking down all the time. And so just to continue existence, forget about replication, just to continue existence, they need imports.
So they are degrading energy and creating entropy.
They're degrading energy, creating entropy, and they're building molecules. And in these building of molecules, there are wastes. So I see this as not just the energy. A lot of people like to focus on the energy, but I like to sort of come as someone who comes out of analyzing the global carbon cycle. I like to think about what are the materials involved. And there's waste products. So we export carbon dioxide waste. Actually, all the cells in our body are exporting carbon dioxide waste and needing oxygen, and the plants are doing the opposite. But the early life forms had to import and export, and what that did, and so they are systems that had to import and export, which the prior systems did not need. The atom can exist by itself out in space. Certain molecules can exist by itself.
So it doesn't have to degrade any energy to preserve its stable order.
Right.
Prebiotic things don't have to.
Right. And it doesn't need to import new materials to replace degrading materials that are inside its metabolism.
In a way, that's surprising because it does preserve structure, and the second law of thermodynamics says that structure can't persist forever, and that's the reason life has to import energy, right? You think that any stable structure, if it lasts very long, has to.
Well, we don't know. It looks like the proton may be immortal, Bob. It looks the physicists are not sure. Some of the theories searching for deeper levels lead to predictions that the proton itself would have a lifetime, but it's way longer than the lifetime of our universe. So we don't have to. So it looks like the proton might be the real God particle. I mean, they talk about the Higgs boson being the God particle, but if you like to think of God being immortal, as some of the cultures do, the proton seems to be our best candidate. And then combining with neutrons, you can get something at least close enough to immortality there.
Okay.
That happens. But what happens with the cell, with the living cell, again, to go back to material, since it's importing material that now defined as nutrients to it because it needs certain chemicals in the environment, it is inherently decreasing the concentrations of those in the environment. And the fact that it's putting out wastes that are toxic to it, that it's created, means it's degrading its environment biochemically.
Right.
And now that you have replicating cells, you have and there's imperfections in that replication. There's inherent variation, and now there has to be inherent competition among these variants due to the properties, due to the biochemical need of the cell to import materials and export waste, and therefore it's degrading the material qualities of its environment. So the evolutionary dynamics immediately follow.
Right. So, and we still don't know. So the key threshold here is the patterns. I mean, a big molecule or whatever, a pattern, what you could call a pattern of information, replicates itself, and that's in a certain sense maybe why we call it information, because it leads to another structure that preserves a certain pattern that was there in the original structure.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I just tell you, I'm not that hot on the word information. It is itself a hot word, but it gets used by people in many different ways. So one has to be careful. But you're equating it to pattern. I'm totally on board with that.
Okay.
In terms of this patterning that happens.
And that's what leads into a whole new kind of system, the system of life. And as you said, I think basically, so it boils down to the fact that in a certain sense, resources are finite. I mean, each of these patterns needs something to keep replicating, to preserve the structure. It needs to, in a certain sense, eat structure. It needs to bring in structured energy. There's only so much of that. Also, there's only so much space on the planet. There's only so much, there's all these kinds of competition kick in, and that accelerates natural selection, and here we are.
And now you're thinking about getting into the eukaryotic cell, which is the combination
of complex.
It
has like a nucleus, and it has, like our cells have, they have mitochondria. So
our cells are all eukaryotic cells.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like, at least on Earth, complex multicellularity would not have come into existence had it not been for the eukaryotic cell, which many biologists say was the most important event in evolution after the origin of life itself.
And do they know if that happened more than once? I mean, they do think that multicellular life evolved independently more than once. Do they know whether the eukaryotic cell?
The eukaryotic cell, this is one I think one of the amazing facts. It looks like the eukaryotic cell is monophyletic, so it looks like the animal eukaryotic cell, the plant, the fungi, the free-living eukaryotic cells like amoebas and paramecia, that they all came from a single merger. I mean, it doesn't mean like only one single merger, but a population of, they call it the LECA, right, the last eukaryotic common ancestor, as opposed to LUCA, the last universal common ancestor of the origin of life. But this LECA, but now why? The questions that I had that I was asking different biologists, and I say some of this in the book, just to me, if there were advantages in cooperation between some of these prokaryotic cells, and we know there are lots of symbioses out there in the biological world, why weren't there other prokaryotic symbioses that led to a transfer of a genome and a new kind of cell? And the answers I got were it might have happened multiple independent times, and those other eukaryotic, proto-eukaryotic types went extinct for unknown reasons. Or it was, and that's interesting also in itself, because if 9 out of 10 went extinct, why were we just lucky that one?
Well, it could have been that it was the superior model. I mean, it's like when people say, well, why aren't there a bunch of other species kind of like humans? Well, we killed them. That's why.
But it looks like, so one of the biologists, Nick Lane, who writes about this, I haven't been able to come up with an idea of what would be such a great app of a particular lineage of eukaryotic cell, because they could feed on bacteria, or they could and he says it's hard to imagine what would have been an exclusion, what they call niche exclusion. Now humans are a different thing, because we might have been competing for the same resource. That is worth thinking about longer. The other possibility is, which is some of the biologists brought up to me, is that it might have been really difficult to form that eukaryotic cell, because it wasn't just an ordinary symbiosis of them going their own way or even attached to each other. One's now inside the other, and and they had, if you didn't have a transfer of the genome into this nucleus, you would have conflict between these two organisms that would have been following their own sort of genetic,
right. They had to come to terms about kind of the pathway of information into the next generation, or pathway of whatever you want to call it in the next.
Right, and it looks like the transfer of the genomes from these bacteria that became the mitochondria into some sort of central area that may have eventually become the nucleus that was probably the archaea prokaryotic cell. It looks like that was really, really necessary to have a single genome.
So I guess that's the degree of complexity that could explain why, when you get to multicellular life, it was independently invented more than once. But what you're saying is, well, that's a simpler problem. For a bunch of cells to get together and just kind of cross the threshold from society of cells to organism is a simpler problem than the creation of the eukaryotic cell was.
Yeah, and of course it may only be on Earth it's a simpler problem, because our eukaryotic cell was particularly richly generative of, our ancient, not meaning our body cells, but the original eukaryotic cell, just because there were multiple pathways into multicellularity, was particularly generative of multicellularity. Yeah. And I personally think it had something to do with I'm not the only one saying this. Some biologists I quote say this, but solving the problem of conflicts between the prokaryotic cells to make the eukaryotic cell predisposed that eukaryotic cell into some cooperativity that why plants and maybe a couple lineages of fungi, why kelp, which is a lineage of algae different from plants, even though they look like plants, and animals were all these multicellular pathways that got explored by the eukaryotic cell.
And in any event, there came to be de facto cooperation among the elements of the eukaryotic cell. I mean, they right. have to work together harmoniously. The mitochondria, which transmits its DNA, I think, through the maternal line in our species or
yes.
something, it has to work cooperatively with the nucleus, which has its own DNA, if they're both going to get their DNA into the next generation, right?
Yeah, well, it's a very tiny amount of DNA in the mitochondria now. They call it the biologists call it just a remnant DNA, probably because there were certain the mitochondria themselves replicate, and it might exactly why that amount got left, and that varies among organisms. But when we get to the cells that formed our body, understanding that cooperativity is a little bit easier, because all the cells in our body have the same genome, and in a way it was just a matter of, not that simple, of the multicellular organism learning to turn genes off and on, but basically off to form specialized tissues and specialized organs,
right.
whether it be a tree or whether it be an animal.
Right. So
that cooperativity is explained. The possible conflicts between the genomes within our body are explained. Like, why is, because not all our cells, most of our cells have given up their ability to go out into the world and just, in fact, I don't know if any cell in the body, you could just put it out into a pond and say, good luck, brains, good luck, nerve cell, No, that nerve cell's going to get eaten up by,
right.
another cell, or he's going to die and get eaten up.
So if one big threshold was the advent of replication of pattern, in other words, the prerequisite for life, another big threshold is culture. Defined broadly the way anthropologists would, to include technology, religion. Basically, any information we transmit from one human to another that is not transmitted genetically is part of the raw material of culture, right?
Right. And so culture. I like what you just said. A very general definition of culture. I like the general definition of culture there. Language comes in there. Tools of some kind, things that are between people, material that's between people, that a next generation can see that maybe their generation did not even make. I'm not necessarily into when that happened, but in terms of combogenesis, in terms of my theory or my scheme of the logic, it goes from animal. It doesn't go just from our body. It goes from the animal society. Now, some people like to say, "Oh, we are like are we a superorganism? Are we a eusocial like the ants?" I actually frame it and see it by analyzing it that culture came from primate groups, chimpanzee-like, gorilla-like primate groups, and the early culture, the primary groups are thought by the paleoanthropologists not to be very much larger, maybe even smaller than current chimpanzee communities of maybe 50 or so, or 30 or 40. And so what did culture had? Well, it had what, if you look at it from the Combogenesis grand sequence scheme that I've developed, a key was it was groups of groups. It wasn't just groups that had culture, it was groups of groups. They call these metagroups or hypersociality, hypergroups. There's different languages floating around in the literature, but what it means is that people can go, some of the people can go and join another group, or they left their group and people in the original group still remember the names and hear stories about what's been going on with that person for a couple years since they visited. There's some data being shown about how many in the hunter-gatherers of South America that still exist, how many nappers of tools a typical male who does the tool napping down there will see in a lifetime. And it goes up to hundreds because of the circulation that's happening in this meta group structure. So one way of framing the origin of culture is that there are groups out there of primates that are, for the most part, competitive with each other, and the larger cooperation happens by forming these meta groups. It looks like these were necessary to have a large enough population so cultural traditions did not die out. Mm-hmm. They can show that can happen too. So then you can have materials that are carvings, tools that are being passed around among these groups. You can have language, which is also a very fantastic bridger of getting people out of these local groups into this metagroup structure.
And the more human minds you have, like in contact, potentially in collaboration, sharing information, sharing innovation, the more that you have, the bigger the social brain, so to speak. Yeah. Presumably, the faster the innovation. So it kind of feeds on itself. I mean, once you have technologies like roads that bring people in touch, eventually you have writing. And then you get to the current age where, you can collaborate with thousands of people all over the world and you get a rate of technological evolution such as we're seeing.
Yeah, and that gets into, I mean, that is consistent with Robin Dunbar's social brain, the sort of social brain idea of given the human brain size, mapping numbers of social relations, that the social relations implied by that are greater than the anthropologists think we're living in the primary group. Fred Myers, who's here at NYU, he's told me about the hunter and gatherer Aboriginals of Australia that he's worked on, and how they move between these bands. That these bands, it's not that there's no competition among people. There could be competition among people within a band, but that people are allowed to sort of switch back and forth between these bands. It's not just the males leaving like it might be, or females leaving like it might be biologically in certain primate groups, but it could be nuclear families leaving, or just split because they're unhappy, or they want to go explore over the mountain, or go visit Grandpa Garog, who they've heard is still living over there. So then I see culture dynamics. I mean, as you've done a lot of work with culture and biology, and sort of with your Nonzero work. In a way, you're doing a sort of a meta patterns analysis of looking at dynamics that are common to biology and culture. Looking at at game theoretic dynamics which are common across these realms. But clearly some new things come in with culture. One is language, and one thing I'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, not that language itself is a creation of culture. I
No.
mean, it is biologically grounded, but it greatly facilitates the transmission of culture.
Yeah. So one of the terms I develop in the book is a term called the alpha kit,
Mm-hmm.
and the alpha kit consists of a tier that is a set of things that are very small in number. It's not just two shown here, and they can combine into large numbers. And this happens. One thing, and this has been, people have said that, isn't it interesting that language is like genetics in certain ways, in which a small number of parts get recombined and to make something larger. And so I think it is really interesting, and I think it's the discovery of a common pattern in the way the 20 amino acids can combine into the millions and billions of individual proteins that allow biological complexity to happen at the start of biological evolution. And if you're willing to say we don't understand fully the origin of culture, but at some point sophisticated language was really important because of what it allowed for the transmission across generations and the ability to name things in the environment, which then you can model in your mind. And the fact that language consists of phonemes, of a small number of phonemes that can combine into basically, for our purposes, an infinite number of words.
Right. So phonemes are units of sound.
Phonemes are units of sound. There's more of them than the letters of the alphabet, basically because there's there's multiple ways to say the letter A in different vowel sounds for A's. So they say there's about 40 phonemes in English, for example.
Okay, so now
I see the generative. So I see that really linked to the newness of culture. That culture has its own evolutionary dynamics, which I want to sort of touch base with you on. Has dynamics of propagating pattern, varying pattern, and selecting pattern. And the cultural evolution people, Daniel Dennett's talking about the algorithmic quality of biological evolution and cultural evolution, but David Sloan Wilson likes the word recipe. That there's kind of there's a recipe. Again, there's a dynamics which is within biological evolution and cultural evolution as a propagation, variation, and selection dynamics. They're not, how they manifest are not the same.
Right.
How cultural evolution works, but the fact that it's now generating pattern in a new way is really fundamental to what took off with. But and if you follow through my count, it's actually level 10. We're not going to go through the levels, but it's level 10 is the origin of culture with these metagroup by the Upper Paleolithic.
And then beyond the level 10, do your levels roughly correspond to kind of political or social structures? I mean, so you have a hunter-gatherer village at one, that's kind of the primordial unit, I guess, in a certain sense of human social organization. But then you eventually get to the state, and sometimes anthropologists, talk about intermediate units like the so-called chiefdom, multi-village qualities associated with early agriculture. So anyway, there is an ascent of the scope of social and political organization that's an important part of your story, right?
Right. And in a sense, once humans, modern humans and anatomically modern humans with culture come on the scene, you could say one of the things humans are doing is bringing stuff in from the environment. They're sort of doing micro combogenesis all the time. New rocks are being found and used. Metals are being found and used. And so, are there any major steps? And so, it is problematic to go from the hunter-gatherer meta group network to definitely the chiefdom type society can happen. They call them complex hunter-gatherers. It can happen. Their social complexity, some level of social complexity, can happen without prior to agriculture. Where if the resources are really abundant, like in the Pacific Northwest with the salmon ponds, but they're tied to those they're tied to those areas. So thinking about it, I'm positing the origin of agriculture as a great revolution. No great revolution there. The origin of agriculture is the Neolithic revolution that you talk about also. But if you think about
and I wasn't exactly the first, but go ahead. Yeah.
Worth the first, yeah. No, but from this framework I've been developing, plants and animals being brought in, that is a merger. That is really a profound merger, because now we've brought plants and animals in as the energy components of our system, rather than having to go outside looking for them in nature.
Right.
We're now controlling them. Some people say they're controlling us, because they're probably human behavior had to become more cooperative, because now storage was important, and not using up things. If maybe people were hungry, they had to think about the future, and because they were thinking about the future, not that they were thinking about the future, but they had to think about it in a different way. So I see the origin of agriculture as level 11, and what that did, it didn't allow just for complexity, because that was already being explored by some of the hunter-gatherer groups that had a lot of abundance near them, but it did allow this whole system now of an agro-village, so I call the agro-village network as this level 11, that could start literally transplanting itself into the landscape in different places where densities of people could not have lived any other way prior to that.
Okay.
So that's what I see, why agriculture was a major step.
So now we are, some might say, on the verge of, we have a system of states. I made the argument in my book Nonzero that if you look at how many non-zero-sum problems there are among states that can only be solved through cooperation, environmental problems, weapons of mass destruction, disease, and so on, overfishing the oceans, you're going to need to see, if the whole system is going to survive in good shape, you're going to need to see a certain amount of international governance, right? And so and arguably the movement to a whole new political level. Now, I don't think you have any such urgent call to arms at the end of your book, right? You're more agnostic.
Yeah, I call to arms. I do have a sort of an epilogue. So the geopolitical state I see as a level beyond the agro-village. Now, it's not only larger, but some archaeologists, when they study the formation of these states, it's not just maybe even a little bit of war or gathering materials or people as slaves, but the invention of the geopolitical state had to do with bureaucracy and actually incorporating the people you may have taken over. One of the people I rely on at the Museum of Natural History here, he claims it gets beyond the daily walk. The size of the system gets beyond what the leader can kind of control in a daily sending out somebody. But what they learned is that they can have wars or treaties and actually incorporate. So there's an explosion of potential expansion. But that means the state is in a takeover mode, I think, until really recently, because you think of the World War II was still taking over, and it's still a little bit now, but mostly we're not doing that. So are we on the cusp of a global level? Coming out of my environmental background and concern with, I'm very concerned, as you are in your new book, Bob, which I have to say is a fantastic book. I could really hardly put it down.
The Buddhism book?
Huh?
The Buddhism book. You've read the Buddhism book?
Yes, the Buddhism book.
God bless you.
Yes, and I'm with you on so much of what you are doing in that book in terms of watching the mind and the two kinds of directions of going in and saying, no, that's not me, and that's not me, or going out and saying, wow, all the sensory world is me.
Right.
Okay, I'm not going to remember your terms for those two kinds of non-self.
Right.
I sometimes call it, anyway, to myself, I call it slightly different terms, but your terms were really good. But I do agree with you that we need to think about new kinds of human beings. And I'm very concerned about, can we build a world in which everyone is prosperous? Mm-hmm. And I'm very much concerned about the ethics of that, because if it looks like we cannot, then those of us living in regions of the world that are prosperous, it's in a way it's implying, oh, we are here and the other places cannot get here. Mm-hmm. But if we could build global prosperity, then we can all get here. But when are people going to be happy? When is greed going to decrease? When is anger going to decrease? I really think you're touching up. I'm fully in back of you thinking not just about the geopolitics, let's say, of peace, but what about inner peace? And we're also
the connection between the two.
And the connection between the two. The connection between the two. So I do mention in the prologue this might mean something about it. We might need to reach enlightenment. I don't write the whole book on it like you do about what enlightenment may be. But what I like about what you did is looking at it from a sort of a modern intellectual writer, thinker, and because you now have things that Buddha did not have. You have evolution to bring into the story that was not there. So I'm very, very much with you. If I want to write about sort of the future of agriculture or the future of energy, I will have to bring in some of the insights from your book into that.
Well, I want to tell people this was not a prearranged advertisement for my book, but I appreciate it very much, and we should talk off camera later about saving the world. It sounds like we both want to do it through broadly comparable means. So let me ask you.
Yes.
I mean, a few cosmic issues spring to mind when I look at your book. I mean, first of all, I should just, as a footnote, tell people that this is broadly in a tradition that was once called general systems theory, appreciating similarities among different levels of organization, dynamics, and so on. And so it's good, it's good that you're, I think, furthering that. It's a very challenging field where it's easy to be facile, but I think you work hard not to be, and that's an important advance. There are now back to the cosmic issues. Thanks. Though. This is reminiscent of. Well, first of all, when I think of like broad sweep pictures like this, I think of people, including like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a theologian who thought that there was like a purpose behind it, and I think you got to give him credit for like 70 years ago saying we're building a giant global brain, trust me, kind of, and it seems like we have. Moreover, when you
the noosphere,
the noosphere, and leave that aside. I mean, leave his conjectures aside. The way you tell the story, when you realize, well, the universe was just, inherent in the very birth of the universe was all of these building blocks.
Right. All the possibilities were there,
and in whose nature it was to build larger and larger building blocks. And so on. I mean, you could make the case that, well, it was almost. There are some tricky thresholds to get across, of course, and it took a long time to cross various thresholds. Then again, that's just by our lights. That's by our conception of time. Given the life of the universe, some of these things happen pretty fast. But regardless, it calls to mind the possibility that the universe seems almost kind of built to generate more interesting stuff. And ultimately, that turns out to be stuff that's capable of consciousness and so on. So I assume you're going to say you're not interested in that question, being a scientist in good standing, but...
Wait, so could you...
somebody like Teilhard de Chardin would say, well, this was the purpose of the machine was almost literally built to do this. The way organisms are built to do things, to grow and get more complex.
Right. I did get really fascinated by the standard model of particle physics, thinking about the generativity that was the possibilities that were there in in the quarks and electrons and gluons and photons and those well, the whole structure of the elementary field. But then one's all I guess I also got more amazed by the origin of life being perhaps singular on Earth, or at least we don't. It still could be from other star systems. The singularity of the eukaryotic cell origin is also really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I did realize that all these levels I found them really fascinating to know more about and to go in, even though some I sort of understood very generally, but to go into like in a logically consistent way. Okay, what was really new? And so the birth of these new relations in sequence. I was thinking whether I should try to say certain ones were more inevitable or not. And the only thing I could come up with is that if there were multiple inventions, they were more inevitable. That they were so multicellular.
If it happened more than once, presumably it was more likely to happen.
Right, and the origin of agriculture more than once.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
More inevitable. The geopolitical state more inevitable. So once we got into culture, now it depends on how you look at culture. Whether were the Neanderthals would they have gotten there too? But so the origin of these, the big origins at the standard model of particle physics, the origin of new overarching dynamics, the origin of life, and the origin of culture are what I call the base levels of dynamical realms. So these are these overarching dynamics, and are they, the possibility was there at the start of the universe. Yes, you have to say that, right? I mean, you're not going to say some deity came in and said this wasn't good enough. So we think
but a lot of this. Well, yeah, I don't think you want to go so far as to say life or intelligent life was inherent in the universe, but you would probably say at least the kind of robust potential for these kinds of things was inherent in the universe. Would you go that far?
Yeah. The potential is there. So what I find interesting to think about how you frame is, what do these patterns mean that seem to exist? Not as people talk about the mysteries of math. Why does math work so well? But even in your Nonzero with cooperation, a certain kind of game theoretic structure going from biology into culture. Me with Combogenesis, a repeating pattern going from biology to culture. Or as I like to say, propagation, variation, selection being in biology and culture, or alpha kit structures. That these structures and systems did get discovered. To me, that's a really interesting question, because they're substrate independent. They're more like logical dynamical possibilities that once they get discovered in actual material systems, give those material systems certain kinds of properties or dynamics to allow, in the case of what I've been developing, new fundamental levels to come into being, or that they allow whatever gets allowed by being multicellular. Like sight and sound are really important for the animal body, because now you can have animal groups in which the organisms are not touching each other but are remote, and that is a precursor to language riding on sound waves. So I do find the combination between, I guess, the simplicity of some of these patterns and the complexity of the general systems that spin off them pretty mind-blowing. I find it worthy to contemplate.
Apparently. And you've contemplated it very well. And the book is called Quarks to Culture. Great jacket. Book jacket, worth looking at. Worth buying just to look at the jacket. The subtitle is How We Came to Be. It's, is it Columbia University Press?
Columbia University Press.
Right. Great. So congratulations on the book, Tyler. And later, you and I will get together off camera and save the world.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you.